Alright, hello everybody. This is the usual AW here with me, Hyperion, and Chaya, our local Jewish demonologist.
Hello. Shalom.
Chaya.
Chaya.
Yeah, it'd be Chaya.
Yep. Yes.
And today we're reading a big one. We're reading the German Ideology. Not all of it, of course. Most of it is garbage. Maybe like after this, at some point we read chapter 5, which is so god awful. Like I don't even know how Marx ever thought that was worth publishing or attempting to get published. It's a chapter specifically on idealism, and Christ, it's like Marx just like turned stupid for an entire chapter. But no, we're reading chapter 1, part 1, Feuerbach, Opposition of the Materialist and Idealist Outlook. And the German ideology is from the so-called middle period, which is in 1845, which is not that much later than the 1844 manuscripts. And yet, even here, we start seeing a lot of people whatever. They notice that this is starting to get really different from what like the style of the 1844 manuscripts is, and what the whole argument of the 1844 manuscripts is. Like, 1844 manuscripts are considered a bit more idealistic, but anybody who has read Hegel will tell you, and it's a common knowledge and a run from in Marxology, that early Marx is not Hegelian whatsoever. It's about as far as from Hegel as one can really get, and pretty much anything is far from Hegel except Hegel. And mystics. That's kind of the only other thing that's somewhat close. But yeah, here I think from what the little I've read and the little I know that people cover, it's like this is where Marx sometimes seems like highly deterministic and very economistic. A lot of his basic what would we want to call it? What's that word he loves? Vulgar materialism comes from this, the German ideology. But all right.
And it's the origin of his economic musings.
Yeah, the 1844 manuscripts, he realizes. Yeah, he realizes he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, and he's like, wow, that Engel's gay. Should learn for some political economy from him. So anyways, let's get started. Section A, Idealism and Materialism. The illusions of German ideology. As we hear from German ideologists, Germany has in the last few years gone through an unparalleled revolution. The decomposition of the Hegelian philosophy, which began with Strauss, has developed into a universal ferment, into which all the powers of the past are swept. In the general chaos, mighty empires have arisen only to meet with immediate doom. Heroes have emerged momentarily, only to be hurled back into obscurity by bolder and stronger rivals. And by bolder and stronger, he means him. Marx Strunk.
Yeah.
It was a revolution beside which the French Revolution was child's play, a world struggle beside which the struggles of the Diadochi, I don't know.
Diadochi.
The Diadochi. Successors of Alexander the Great appear insignificant. Principles ousted one another, heroes of the mind overthrew each other with unheard of rapidity, and in 3 years, 1844 through 45, more the past was swept away in Germany than at other times in 3 centuries. All this is supposed to have taken place in the realm of pure thought. Certainly, it is an interesting event we are dealing with, the putrescence of the absolute spirit. When the last spark of its life had failed, the various components of this caput mortem began to decompose, entered into new combinations, and formed new substances. The industrialist of philosophy, who till then had lived on the exploitation of the absolute spirit, now seized upon the new combinations. Each with all possible zeal set about retailing his apportioned share. This naturally gave rise to competition, which to start with was carried on in moderately staid bourgeois fashion. Later, when the German market was glutted, and the commodity, in spite of all efforts, found no response in the world market, the business was spoiled in the usual German manner by fabricated and fictitious production, deterioration in quality, adulteration of the raw materials, falsification of labels, fictitious purchases, bill jobbing, and a credit system devoid of any real basis. The competition turned into a bitter struggle, which is now being extolled and interpreted to us as a revolution of world significance, the begetter of the most prodigious results and achievements. So the battle of philosophy is nothing but a battle of the market of ideas.
Mm-hmm. It's just our mind castles declaring war on each other.
It's just capital estranged in the realm of thought.
Yep.
If we wish to rate it at its true value, this philosophic charlatanry, which awakens even in the breast of the honest German citizen a glow of national pride, if we wish to bring about clearly the pettiness, the parochial narrowness of this whole young Hegelian movement, and in particular the tragic-comic contrast between the illusions of these heroes about their achievements and the actual achievements themselves, we must look at the whole spectacle from a standpoint beyond the frontiers of Germany. Alright, this is a bit of an aside. In the first version of the clean copy, there follows a passage which is crossed out on page 21, and it reads, "We preface, therefore, the specific criticism of individual representatives of this movement with a few general observations, elucidating the ideological premises common to all of them. These remarks will suffice to indicate the standpoint of our criticism insofar as it is required for the understanding and the motivation of the subsequent individual criticisms. We oppose these remarks to Feuerbach in particular because he is the only one who has at least made some progress and whose works can be examined de bonne foi." I don't know if that's how you pronounce that. It's French.
What does it mean? Of good something. Yeah. In good faith. In earnest.
Alright. 1. Ideology in general, and especially German philosophy. A. We know only a single science, the science of history. One can look at history from two sides and divide it into the history of nature and the history of men. The two sides are, however, inseparable. The history of nature and the history of men are dependent on each other so long as men exist. The history of nature, called natural science, does not concern us here, but we will have to examine the history of men, since almost the whole ideology amounts either to a distorted conception of this history or to a complete abstraction from it. Ideology is itself only one of the aspects of this history.
Okay, so why do we think he crossed this out?
I don't know, I probably rewrote it.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, that just
He
seems
was
like,
right,
pretty
definitely, about the
notes.
end. That ideology is only one aspect. A lot of people are just like, oh, well, you're blinded by ideology, and then that's their critique. Well, that's only one part.
Okay, it says, there follows a passage dealing with the premises of the materialist conception of history. It is not crossed out in this volume, and in this volume it is reproduced as section 2. See page 3132. Let me check it out. what the heck is this? I can't tell.
Huh? What do you mean?
Oh, it's subsection 4. I don't know why they published it this way. If they knew it was followed from that, why not just fucking put it in that order?
I don't know.
Search materialist
Did he
conception.
change it or no?
Got like the search bar of that same page. Search materialist conception. It is section 4, the essence of the materialist conception of history. Or rather, just search exactly that. The essence of the materialist conception of history. About halfway. Do we want to read this like that, or do you just want to read it like in the order that
I don't
it is?
care. We'll have to go back. I mean, we're gonna get to this anyway, right?
Oh, this is actually really short. Never mind. Yeah, I thought like it seemed to be longer than it actually was.
Oh,
Like
okay.
it's right after this small section. Continuing, ideology in general. Just go back to the top. Ideology in general, German ideology in particular.
Yeah, I'm here.
German criticism has, right up to its latest efforts, never quitted the realm of philosophy. Far from examining its general philosophic premises, the whole body of its inquiries has actually sprung from the soil of a definite philosophical system, that of Hegel. Not only in their answers, but in the very questions there was a mystification. This dependence on Hegel is the reason why not one of these modern critics has even attempted a comprehensive criticism of the Hegelian system, however much each professes to have advanced beyond Hegel. Their polemics against Hegel and against one another are confined to this. Each extracts one side of the Hegelian system and turns this against the whole system, as well as against the sides extracted by the others. To begin with, they extracted pure, unfalsified Hegelian categories such as substance and self-consciousness. Later, they desecrated these categories with more secular names such as species. Such as the unique man, etc. This is where obviously Stirner made him very, very butthurt.
Yeah.
The entire body of German philosophical criticism from Strauss to Stirner is confined to criticism of religious concepts. Claiming to be the absolute redeemer of the world from all evil. The following passages cross out of the manuscript, claiming to be the absolute redeemer of the world from all evil. Religion was continuously regarded and treated as the arch enemy, as the ultimate cause of all relations repugnant to these philosophers. The critics started from real religion and actual theology. What religious consciousness and their religious conception really meant was determined variously as they went along. Their advance consisted in subsuming the allegedly dominant metaphysical, political, juridical, moral, and other conceptions under the class of religious or theological conceptions, and similarly in pronouncing political, juridical, moral consciousness as religious or theological, and the political, juridical, moral man in the last resort, as religious. I'm surprised they didn't repeat political, juridical again. The dominance of religion was taken for granted. Gradually, every dominant relationship was pronounced a religious relationship and transformed into a cult of law, a cult of the state, etc. On all sides, it was only a question of dogmas and belief in dogmas. The world was sanctified to an ever-increasing extent, till at last our venerable Saint Max was able to canonize it en bloc, and thus dispose of it once and for all.
Praise the spooky saint. The spook-busting saint. I never knew he referred to him as Saint Max.
The whole like most of
I
the
haven't read
German
this.
ideology has the biggest section is Saint
Yeah.
Max, which is just like a giant 300-page diatribe. A giant 300-page shitpost against Max Stirner.
To the max. Yeah.
Lefty pole before lefty pole.
Oh yeah, except walls of text, and it probably
Yeah.
actually reads somewhat well as opposed to most that's on that. The old Hegelians had comprehended everything as soon as it was reduced to a Hegelian logical category. The young Hegelians criticized everything by attributing to it religious conceptions or by pronouncing it a theological matter. The young Hegelians are in agreement with the old Hegelians in their belief in the rule of religion, of concept of a universal principle in the existing world. Only the one party attacks his dominion as usurpation, while the other extols it as legitimate. I don't know, Marx. I think Walter Benjamin outed you out.
Yeah.
He is. It's a very short essay, isn't it? The one like the puppet and the dwarf.
Yeah.
Well, that's like that's the Zizek book. But there's like one in which like he talks
Yeah,
about
that's the Zizek.
Yeah.
but there's the one essay that Benjamin has about materialism and Marxist materialism and historical materialism and like the theological secret behind it or something.
Yep.
It.
Yeah.
And he's right. He's right. Marx never really escaped theology as much as he thought he did. Alright, continuing. Since the young Hegelians consider conceptions, thoughts, ideas, in fact all the products of consciousness to which they attribute an independent existence as the real chains of men, just as the old Hegelians declared them the true bonds of human society, it is evident that the young Hegelians have to fight only against these illusions of consciousness, since according to their fantasy, the relationships of men, all their doings, their chains, and their limitations are products of their consciousness. The young Hegelians logically put to men the moral postulate of exchanging their present consciousness for human, critical, or egoistic consciousness, and thus of removing their limitations. This demand to change consciousness amounts to a demand to interpret reality in another way, that is, to recognize it by means of another interpretation. The young Hegelian ideologists, in spite of their allegedly world-shattering statements, are the staunchest conservatives. The most reasoned of them have found the correct expression of their activity when they declare they are only fighting against phrases. They forget, however, that these phrases they themselves are only opposing other phrases. That to these phrases they themselves are only opposing other phrases, and that they are in no way combating the real existing world when they are merely combating the phrases of this world. The only results which this philosophic criticism could achieve were few, and at that thoroughly one-sided, elucidations of Christianity from the point of view of religious history. All the rest of their assertions are only further embellishments of their claim to have furnished in these unimportant elucidations discoveries of universal importance. It has not occurred to any of these philosophers to inquire into the connection of German philosophy with German reality. The relation of their criticism to their own material surroundings. So any thoughts on that? Any thoughts about this attack on the young Hegelians as these pure idealists who thought all that had to be changed was ideas, and by change they kind of meant convince, somehow reason shall triumph or something like that. I mean, I haven't read any of them, so I can't say like whether Marx is being a good critic of them or not.
It seemed like, from what I've read, they've just adopted Hegel for their own purposes, really. But I don't know. I haven't read enough.
The revise, so I can't really make a good judgment here.
Fair enough, as Space says.
They're, yeah, I would think it's odd if they didn't, like, consider their own circumstances materially when forming their philosophy, but, He could be right.
I mean, I don't know, man. Like, I read some stuff about Fichte. Like Fichte, the arch idealist, the arch subjective idealist. Like, Fichte literally tried to take, if this is to be believed, like historically, apparently Fichte like tried to organize students, like literally start like his own little realm in the university and like slowly take over the rest of Germany. So, if Fichte, was
Yeah.
woke enough to know that, hey, you kind of need actual movement to be doing shit, I find it hard to believe that they didn't realize it either. Not that the question of like whether they saw themselves going anywhere is a whole other question, in which like you think you have a good idea, but you're like, ah, man, who's gonna like go and like join me, like try to go kill the king or something? That's a whole other question. I kind of be like, yeah, it's like anarchists. It's a good idea, and then you ask, well, what are you gonna do? They're like, let's go kill the king. Well, good luck getting enough people to agree to that and trying to put their lives on the line for it.
They don't try to, like, none of these so-called anarchists try to do anything to the actual establishment, though. I'm sorry, I don't mean to attack anarchy.
Depends on what
I'm
country
just-
you're in. Or,
Yeah,
I mean, I
true.
don't mean to judge them by borders, but,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a wave of difference between anarchists in Greece or anarchists in France versus anarchists in the United States. And,
Definitely.
I've
Yeah, I'm
found
speaking
that
from
out,
experience in the U.S.
Yeah.
Yeah, true.
Like, not even, I don't want to get off on this tear, but none of these alt-right or whatever people, I don't know who the recent shooter, his ideology or whatever, I haven't paid attention, but they never try to go after anyone that is important or matters or is a problem. It's just sad. I'm thinking of the dead Kennedys again, sorry.
They're the worst philosophers. I got the best philosophies. Sad. I can't make the Trump voice.
Oh, the Trump, yeah.
They're German ideologists. Sad.
Yeah. I wish you would post that, that'd be great.
Alright, continuing. First premise is materialist method. Now, this is where things should get interesting. The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. These premises can thus be verified in a purely empirical way. And Marx says it, but he's full of shit. Because he doesn't go and actually do this. He's not an empiricist. He never was an empiricist. And yet at the same time, he's like, hey, man, it's just the facts, right? No, it's not. And he knew this. But somehow, like, there's parts of the German ideology in which, like, Marx just kind of forgets everything he learned in philosophy and, like, acts really stupid because he's trying to be scientific. And scientists, they just look at the facts. It's the world. The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. No, you don't say.
At least he said, of course.
Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature.
The sky is blue.
Of course, we cannot here go either into the actual physical nature of man or into the natural conditions of which man finds himself, geological, hydrographical, climatic, and so on. The writing of history must always set out from these natural bases and their modification in the course of history through the action of men.
Sounds like
So,
something you would have heard from Bauer, I guess.
Sounds like something you would hear from Adam Smith.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, we're just starting from like the actual facts. This is how people are. These are the existence. You go out and you meet a random Joe, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna study random Joe, and Joe's a selfish asshole. He only cares about himself. He goes and like has done some deals with like Mary, trade for some chicken eggs for some ham or something. But he doesn't do it because he cared about Mary. He just wanted the chickens.
Yeah.
He just wanted her eggs.
Oh,
You know, therefore we have
gave her the
established.
hand.
Yeah, we've we've established Homo economicus. You see. I mean, you can see how like what Marx is saying here is bullshit. Like, because he doesn't actually do this. Because if you did that, there's so many arbitrary ways you can go ahead and just say, "Look, it's just the facts," and at the face of it, it will be true.
Hmm. It's like how people take an individual experience and then promote it as like a universal thing, and it looks like it is, but it's really not.
But yeah, I mean, there's a really broad way in which, like, obviously it applies to what he does, but I don't think it actually is what he does. Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. Um, you know, what was it that Plato said? You know, featherless, featherless chicken. You know, a featherless flightless bird with like nails.
Yeah.
That distinguishes the human being, as proven by Diogenes.
Yeah. Well, he referred to them as featherless bipeds, right?
Yeah, featherless bipeds.
Yeah.
Alright, they themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. That just seems off to me. It's like you start producing your means of subsistence, you know. Does that mean you recognize that you're not like, you know, like the other animals automatically? I don't know. I mean, that already presupposes the one thing which I think really does distinguish humans from every other animal, which is, you know, a pretty advanced
Yeah.
sense of self-consciousness and conceptions.
Yeah, you can't be like Diogenes and pluck a chicken and then say, "Behold, I've brought you a man," like he did. It required like humans are more than that.
Like, yeah, you know, it
He
wasn't
was
that,
just,
you
he was just being
know,
cheeky, and
we
then
produced
Diogenes.
Diogenes, you know, who would think that a counter argument is like flinging shit at your face.
Yeah. Well, he was a
But yeah,
provocateur.
that's inconsequential, though.
Yeah.
Point is, I don't think that the distinction of human beings from animals or other animals is, oh, you start making your subsistence. It comes before that, by far. You can't really be making your own subsistence if you don't understand things, and you can't understand things if you don't really have a capacity for conception. And if you don't have a capacity for conception, if you don't really have language, yeah, we know this because you know it's now we have plenty of cases of like feral children. They don't got no science. So right, by producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. The way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends first of all on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. Sorry, slowly rereading that. There seems to be a jump there, like from the beginning, and the way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends, first of all, on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individuals, rather it is a definite form of activity of these individuals. Well, no, I guess it's not really a logical jump. He starts talking about the way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends, first of all, on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and have to reproduce. So, assuming you're having like some sort of a not hunter-gatherer, well, kind of hunter-gatherer, or yeah, you could start with hunter-gatherers, I suppose. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of the individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. So, you have a hunter-gatherer society, well, a community or something. Well, you would call it society. The mode of production would be, going out foraging, maybe killing a moose or two, although I don't know if people eat moose. I suppose not. I mean, we don't eat them, probably because they're not tasty. Lucky them. But either way, if you stick with conceptions, God, I already have problems with this because there are conceptions already going on about like the world in such a mode of production in which you cannot escape the fact that the mode of production continues precisely because one has already a given preconception of the world in which one has not yet found the advanced conceptions of agriculture, scientific knowledge of that sort, which would then allow for a sedentary lifestyle, blah, blah, blah. But actually, Marx would say, aha, there you go, it's materialism, you see? Because it's the means of production, it's the technologies, forces of production. So, never mind. So what they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. So, if you had like a hunter-gatherer society, the reason why, there would be either no division of labor or a certain division of labor would be, just due to the material circumstances. Maybe the men go hunting because, they're just more apt and fit for it, physically. Maybe the women go fishing or, hunting berries or blah, 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 because, it's something easier, not so dangerous. Typical, materialist conceptions of whatnot. This production only makes its appearance with the increase of population. In its turn, this presupposes the intercourse of individuals with one another. The form of this intercourse is again determined by production, and this is intercourse in just interrelation rather than intercourse as in, sexy time.
Yeah.
Or maybe he's talking about sexy time. I don't know. This production only makes its appearance with the increased population. In its turn, this presupposes the intercourse of individuals with one another. An increase of population certainly does presuppose an intercourse of individuals with one another. Particularly males and females.
Yeah. Well, he used Verkehr, which is, a euphemism. So I'm pretty sure he is talking about sexual intercourse.
The form of this intercourse is again determined by production. So, do hunter-gatherers have sex differently than, sedentary farmers?
Probably.
And maybe rituals and whatnot. I mean, there is that movie, Children of the Corn. Weird movie.
Oh, yeah. The Stephen King novel. Novel. Book.
3.
Trash book.
Production and intercourse. Divisions of labor and forms of property. Tribal, ancient, feudal. Here comes the stages of history.
Yep.
The first history, theory of history, Marxist theory of history, basically. The relations of different nations among themselves depend upon the extent to which each has developed its productive forces, division of labor, and internal intercourse. This statement is generally recognized, but not only the relation of one nation to others, but also the whole internal structure of the nation itself depends on the stage of development reached by its production and its internal and external intercourse. How far the productive forces of a nation are developed is shown most manifestly by the degree to which the division of labor has been carried out. Each new productive force, insofar as it is not merely a quantitative extension of productive forces already known, for instance the bringing into cultivation of fresh land, causes a further development of the division of labor. Although I don't know, one kind of has questions about how much this is true. In which, the division of labor only sort of appears in a really weak way up until, capitalism.
Yeah.
You go to feudalism, and most of the serfs are just kind of each living in the semi-independently in their own land. They grow a pig or some chickens or two, and they grow their wheat, and maybe some neighbor down the line has something that they don't, but they're not really interdependent in the way of a division of labor of I'll only grow wheat, you only grow pigs, and then we'll exchange for our extras. That doesn't really seem to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, I mean, stuff like nomadic hunter-gathering tribes, the division of labor seems to kind of happen and not really happen either, in which, sometimes...
It's it's not a set division of labor like it is in these other economic systems.
Yeah, I mean, it's basic, seemingly general ones where, the mom takes care of the kids, or, or at least some women take care of the kids, and not just, one woman. Because, it just seems like the natural thing. But other than that, sometimes it was the case, the men hunted, the women, picked berries, and but they also fished, and sometimes they also hunted, and so it wasn't really a set thing, and they did artisanry, and everybody kind of could do whatever it is that they were just whatever good at or felt like doing. There wasn't really any strict division of labor, and even then you come to feudalism, farming. Well, you had even up to the age of the 1700s, you still had it in the U.S., for example, mostly people living independently on the land. You're the independent farmer, and you kind of just traded things not out of necessity, but just because you had a little extra and you felt like getting something that you didn't really have. You had your chickens, you had your pigs, and you had your shitty corn. If you wanted something else, well then you had to do a bit of a market exchange. But the market wasn't all subsuming, and so the division of labor wasn't this thing that people really depended on. And then we could say, well, there was a division of labor in the house. The woman, milked the cow, raised the chickens. The man, plowed the fields, or whatever. But that also kind of didn't happen. When you were poor, and that was just it. You worked the farm, man or woman, and
yeah.
seems the only thing women generally didn't do was like go out hunting. You know, it's like in the woods. That was it. So, you know, when he says this statement is generally recognized, but not only the relation of one nation to others, but also the whole internal structure of the nation itself depends on the stage of development reached by its production, its internal and external intercourse. Sure, I suppose. To some extent, but I mean, that already is kind of presupposing that there's already a unified like nation going on and working, and you know, that people are subsumed into this totalizing process in which they must take place. They must give and therefore must also take. Continuing to the next paragraph, the division of labor inside a nation leads at first to the separation of industrial and commercial from agricultural labor, and hence to the separation of town and country into the conflict of their interest. Its further development leads to the separation of commercial from industrial labor. At the same time, through the division of labor inside these various branches, there develop various divisions among individuals cooperating in different kinds of labor. The relative position of these individual groups is determined by the methods employed in agriculture, industry, and commerce. Patriarchalism, slavery, estates, classes. These same conditions are to be seen given a more developed intercourse in the relations of different nations to one another. I mean, I think it's interesting to take notice that the only real examples he gave there are capitalist examples of the division of labor. The various stages of development and division of labor are just so many different forms of ownership. That is, the existing stage in the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to the material, instrument, and product of labor. The first form of ownership is tribal ownership. It corresponds to the undeveloped stage of production in which people live. A people lives by hunting and fishing, by the rearing of beasts, or in the highest stage, agriculture. In the latter case, it presupposes a great mass of uncultivated stretches of land. Division of labor is at this stage still very elementary and is confined to a further extension of the natural division of labor existing in the family. The social structure is therefore limited to an extension of the family, patriarchal family chieftains, below them the members of the tribe, finally slaves. Slavery latent in the family only develops gradually with the increased population, the growth of wants, and with the extension of external relationships, both of war and of barter. Of course, we know this is obviously not historically true. Not every so-called primitive communist group was patriarchal or matriarchal. I mean, what is it? There's like this one group that is like strangely very, very like the closest to like absolute anarchism as one comes. Like they're like highly, highly suspicious of authoritarianism in any form, and you know, pretty independent with each other.
I know the group you're talking about. Aren't they? They reside in Tanzania, I think, in Africa, East Africa. I think so.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But either way, they exist. So, you know, it's the whole like, oh, you know, there's always this kind of a natural division of labor. No, not really. If you want to be a stay-at-home dad in some primitive communist societies, they allowed you to, and there was no shame in that.
There were some Snickers behind your back, probably. I want to be, though. Yeah. That sounds nice.
So, that's at the end of that paragraph. The slavery latent in the family only develops gradually with the increase of population, the growth of wants, and with the extension of external relations, both of war and of barter. I mean, this is taking a really Eurocentric view, which the family was owned. Actually, it sounds strangely Asiatic, strangely Chinese, at least if we are to believe Hegel. Because according to Hegel, the Chinese family literally was one in which the patriarch of the family owned everybody and could sell them off if he felt like it. The second form is ancient communal and state ownership, which proceeds especially from the union of several tribes into a city by agreement or by conquest, in which is still accompanied by slavery. Beside communal ownership, we already find movable and later also immovable private property developing as an abnormal form subordinate to communal ownership. The citizens hold power over their laboring slaves only in their community, and on this account alone, therefore, they are bound to the form of communal ownership. It is the communal private property which compels the active citizens to remain in this spontaneously derived form of association over against their slaves. For this reason, the whole structure of society based on this communal ownership and with it the power of the people decays in the same measure as, in particular, immovable private property evolves. The division of labor is already more developed. We already find the antagonism of town and country, later the antagonism between those states which represent town interests and those which represent country interests. And inside the towns themselves, the antagonism between industry and maritime commerce. The class relation between citizens and slaves is now completely developed. I assume here he's talking about Greece. Greece or, Rome.
Yeah. Maybe Egypt.
I don't know. I think it's mostly Greece.
Oh, like
Communal ownership. He could be talking about Sparta.
Sparta, yeah. Well, Sparta's in Greece.
Yeah. I don't know. There's definitely a logical jump here. I mean, there's been a couple logical jumps in which you suddenly have talking about the family, and then somehow from family you get slavery.
Yeah.
Somehow from that link of slavery we jump to the generalized slavery and the developments of the developments of state as such, the developments of
Yeah, I was just thinking about Egypt because of the class relation between citizens and slaves now completely developed. I mean, we get the picture of the slaves building the pyramids and being whipped and stuff, but that's not really how it was. I don't want to get into that. I'm not trying to justify slavery, but I'm just saying, obviously, I don't think the slaves really built the pyramids if they weren't built, if they were built by humans, they were given a wage, the people that built the pyramids, because there are records of it. It's interesting how advanced they were, sociologically. Not with the slave relation, obviously, but women could hold jobs in public office and things like that. It's nice.
So you're basically saying it's not that you're saying that it was aliens, but it was totally aliens.
I don't want to get into my alien stuff, but yeah, definitely. I don't want to get into the alien carcasses found in the ancient tombs or anything like that.
But you can see actually, no, this passage of the last paragraph, well, no, this paragraph before that, but the slavery latent in the family. You can see why he said he wanted to destroy the family. That actually explains something.
Yeah.
All right, but going back to
I
where we
kind of knew
left
why.
off.
I just didn't agree, really.
Because it's not universal. Like, not every
Yeah.
family like treats their kids like they're slaves. That was something peculiar to just like the harsh conditions of Europe for the most part, and rather just the general outlook of Europe. I mean, it was noting there's plenty of other like Native Americans here. Like, there were quite a few tribes that people met and recorded, and they treat their children very well. So the family, or they weren't patriarchal and all this stuff. What was it? I was reading something about that just yesterday or something. Ah, yes, I was looking, just like skimming over Engel's Origin of the Family, and he was talking about Native American family structures,
Mm-hmm.
in which I think obviously he wasn't really holding on to this idea that the family was like slavery anymore. Because the very thing he was talking about was like about how interesting certain structures of the family were, in which they were a lot more extensive than our modern uh, views are. Like,
Yeah.
I forget what tribe he was talking. He was talking about a couple tribes, and he says like that what one considers like one's like family, like in like a really strong sense, like has this weird structure of like the dad, from the dad's side, like his brother's children count as his own children, and are treated as such. From the mom's side, her sister's children count as their own children, but are treated as such. So you have more kids than you ever give birth to, but they're your kids, and you treat them that way. And I didn't finish reading like what he was saying, that there was some sort of like other Hawaiian family structure, which was a bit more primitive than that. I don't know on what account he thought it was more primitive, but apparently explained why they had that structure in the first place, and I don't know. Either way, it didn't seem like slavery to me. The third form of ownership is feudal or state property. Oh, sorry, I skipped a paragraph. With the development of private property, we find here for the first time the same conditions which we shall find again, only on a more extensive scale, with modern private property. On the one hand, the concentration of private property, which began very early in Rome, as the Licinian agrarian law proves, and proceeded very rapidly from the time of the civil wars, and especially under the emperors. The emperors, on the other hand, coupled with this, the transformation of the plebeian, small peasantry into a proletariat, which, however, owing to its intermediate position between property, citizens, and slaves, never achieved independent development. It's a shame the Gracchi brothers did not succeed.
Yeah.
The first modern populist. And he got murdered. Alright, continuing. The third form of ownership is feudal or state property. If antiquity started out from the town and its little territory, the Middle Ages started out from the country. This different starting point was determined by the sparseness of the population at the time, which was scattered over a large area and which received no large increase from the conquerors. In contrast to Greece and Rome, feudal development at the outset, therefore, extended over a much wider territory prepared by the Roman conquest and the spread of agriculture at first associated with it. The last centuries of the declining Roman Empire and its conquest by the barbarians destroyed a number of productive forces. Agriculture had declined, industry had decayed for want of a market, trade had died out or been violently suspended, which the communists will also violently suspend. The rural and urban population had decreased. From these conditions and the mode of organization of the conquest determined by them, feudal property developed under the influence of the Germanic military constitution. Like tribal and communal ownership, it was based again on a community, but the directly producing class standing over against it is not, as in the case of the ancient community, the slaves, but the enserfed small peasantry. As soon as feudalism is fully developed, there also arises antagonism to the towns. The hierarchical structure of land ownership and the armed bodies of retainers associated with it gave the nobility power over the serfs. This feudal organization was, just as much as the ancient communal ownership, an association against a subjected producing class. But the form of association and the relation to the producers were different because of the different conditions of production. This also, I think, is a huge reduction of what feudalism really was like. I mean, apparently peasant revolts were all the fad all the time, and they were really constantly going on. The kings never really had that much power, absolute monarchy was just like a shortly lived thing with France. For the most part, it didn't exist. Like the feudal lords kind of went "fuck you" to the kings and said, "Make me." Anytime the king, wanted to do something, they didn't feel like it.
Yeah.
And the knights also were the same thing. They're like, "Well, king, you don't got money, so we ain't gonna do shit." And then also probably there were plenty of times which the peasants went to the knights and said, "Fuck you, you guys don't do shit for us. We keep getting raped by the French. And you just sit around on your ass." So, not really this highly unified, structured, well-oiled machinery of hierarchy, really. Not only that, you had these really shitty, you had poor feudal lords in which you own a lot of land, but it's a lot of shitty land. And your peasants hate you, and you hate the peasants, and the land just fucking sucks, and you can't produce shit. And you can't move and say, well, I don't even want it, because the king's like, it's your fucking land, you're stuck to it. Because it was property, but it wasn't private property which you could just alienate. It was stuck to you. It was your parents gave you this shitty old beat up car, and you could never leave it. And you gotta take it everywhere you go. And literally, if you try to leave it, the law will come knocking at your door and say, "By the way, you left your shitty car. Here, take it back, and don't you forget it." Anyways, I don't even know what... I'm ranting and rambling. Point is, feudalism wasn't this monolithic thing that people think it was. Modern history on medieval stuff has just kind of broken down this whole idea that we've had that the king's really powerful, the nobility were all powerful, and it was just shit was mostly fucked, man. If anybody had a more or less probably the strongest grasp was the church, and even then the church was eh. Constant power grabs, they hated each other. This feudal system of land ownership had its counterpart in the towns in the shape of corporative property, the feudal organization of trades. Here, property consisted chiefly in the labor of each individual person. The necessity for association against the organized robber nobility, the need for communal cover for communal covered markets in an age when the industrialist was at the same time a merchant, the growing competition of the escaped serfs swarming into the rising towns, the feudal structure of the whole country, these combined to bring about the guilds, the gradually accumulated small capital of individual craftsmen and their stable numbers, as against the growing population, evolved the relation of journeyman and apprentice, which brought into being in the towns a hierarchy similar to that in the country. So, and it's also, the early burgers, because, it's like Hamburg, Freiburg, Bamberg. So, just meant city, and they were burgers. Not to be confused with the modern burger, which is American. Thus, the chief form of property during the feudal epoch consisted on the one hand of landed property with serf labor chained to it, as well as the aristocracy chained just as much as the land, and on the other of the labor of the individual with small capital commanding the labor of journeyman. The organization of both was determined by the restricted conditions of production, the small scale and primitive cultivation of the land, and the craft type of industry. There was little division of labor in the heyday of feudalism. Each country bore in itself the antithesis of town and country. The division into estates was certainly strongly marked, but apart from the differentiation of princes, nobility, clergy, and peasants in the country, and masters, journeymen, apprentices, and soon also the rabble of casual laborers in the town, no division of importance took place. In agriculture, it was rendered difficult by the strip system, beside which the cottage industry of the peasants themselves emerged. In industry, there was no division of labor at all in the individual trades themselves, and very little seen between them. Separation of industry and commerce was found already in existence in older town. In the newer, it only developed later. When the towns entered into mutual relations. The grouping of larger territories into feudal kingdoms was a necessity for the landed nobility as for the towns. The organization of the ruling class and nobility had therefore everywhere a monarch at its head. So not much division of labor, despite the fact that you had agricultural technology. Which seems to me to be a slight contradiction with what the hell he was talking about earlier. But then one could say, the movement is seen in the fact that, these burgs begin to prop up. Precisely because, they don't have to all be farming and weaving and doing all the stuff of just subsistence living anymore. They offer services which, the poor peasants may want, as well as the rich aristocracy, or what was often also the case of, the poor, broken aristocracy, as well as the church. So, that small surplus that was possible allowed for these burghers to come about. And, the antithesis of the town and country. I don't quite know what he means by that antithesis. I mean, obviously, the town and the country have, slightly different interests, but, these, completely, contradictory interests in which, if one favors one and one does not favor the other, you can't help the countryside without fucking the cities, or, what? I don't know. What do people think? Hyperion?
Oh, you mean what do we think?
Yeah, what do you people think?
Oh.
What does that mean, the antithesis of town and country?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, couldn't you make the argument that the town and the countryside are or there's some kind of antagonism there between the two? Like the city is dependent on the countryside for food with agriculture. I can't think right now. Sorry.
Okay, I
But
get it now. Yeah.
yeah.
I thought he meant those together. Now that... Yeah, I read the footnote, too.
Just a footnote? What does it say? I don't know.
I don't know if it's to this, but I googled town and country to see where we were since I went to the bathroom. But it just talks about, like, it says the building of house. No, hold on. Let me find the part that is relevant.
There was little division of labor in the heyday of feudalism. Each country bore in itself the antithesis of town and country. The division into estates was certainly strongly marked, but apart from the differentiation of princes, nobility, and clergy, and peasants in the country, and masters, journeymen, and apprentices, and students, also the rabble of casual laborers in towns, no division of importance took place.
It says here, the setting up of a communal domestic economy presupposes the development of machinery, of the use of natural forces, and of many other productive forces, for example, of water supplies, of gas lighting, steam heating, etc., the removal of the antagonism of town and country.
I mean, but that's for industrial capitalism. Like in feudalism, that doesn't seem to be the case. In which like, you have a dependency of like the town on the country, but other than that, like was there some kind of antagonism in like helping one or helping the other? Like,
it seemed more that the country helped the town more so than the town really helped the country. I mean, they must have gone to towns for certain amenities or things they wanted, but the country provided food, etc.
Not only that, I mean, like it was like the ideal then, wasn't it? Just like to get into a guild. Like nobody wanted like their son to come to keep being a farmer like they were. They're like, you gotta go learn a trade. So they try to get their kids apprentice all the time.
Sure.
To move up in the world. So I mean, there was an antithesis in which, like, I suppose, like the country was slowly eliminating the town. The ideal was to get the hell out of the country.
Yeah, but the country people were necessary as well at the same time.
I don't know what the hell the contradiction is here between in feudalism. I mean, it's not like a Ukraine situation of like if you feed the country, you ain't gonna feed the town. If you feed the town, you ain't gonna feed the country. In which like one heavily favors the other, and like that's a sort of contradiction, but not really. It's a problem, but it's not really a logical contradiction. All right. Would you mind reading like from here on the essence of materialist conception of history?
Yeah, sure. The essence of the materialist conception of history, social being, and social consciousness. The fact is, therefore, that definite individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into these definite social and political relations.
Definitely.
Empirical observation. Huh? What?
Definitely.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Empirical observation must in each separate instance bring out empirically, and without any mystification and speculation, the connection of the social and political structure with production. The social structure and the state are continually evolving out of the life process of definite individuals, but of individuals not as they may appear in their own or other people's imagination, but as they really are, that is to say, as they operate, produce materially, and hence as they work under definite material limits, presuppositions, and conditions independent of their will.
I like how he's doing a bit of a sophistic trick here, and like he's like, we're talking about concrete individuals in concrete situations, concretely.
Yeah.
It's like, we're talking about the empirical. We're going to divide it empirically, as if saying it is proving anything. I mean, if you're going to do it, you do it. You don't just say, we're gonna talk about definite individuals in definite circumstances, definitively. Well,
yeah. Let's see if
Yeah.
he does it. Okay, the following passage is crossed out in the manuscript. The ideas which these individuals form are ideas either about their relation to nature, or about their mutual relations, or about their own nature. It is evident that in all these cases their ideas are the conscious expression, real or illusory, of their real relations and activities, of their production, of their intercourse, of their social and political conduct. The opposite assumption is only possible if, in addition to the spirit of the real, materially evolved individuals, a separate spirit is presupposed. If the conscious expression of the real relations of these individuals is illusory, if in their imagination they turn reality upside down, then this in its turn is the result of their limited material mode of activity and their limited social relations arising from it. We're going to reread that.
And you think it's worth reading?
I mean, I get it, but I don't really have much to say about it.
I mean, here's one thing I suppose can be said, at the beginning of there. The ideas which these individuals form are ideas either about their relations to nature, or about their mutual relations, or about their own nature. Well, where do you think those come from? It is evident that in all these cases their ideas are the conscious expression, real or illusory, of their real relations and activities, of their production, of their intercourse, of their social and political conduct. But that doesn't explain where they come from, really. Like, why those specific ideas? You get some people who, like, early on have, like, something like animism, for example, in which, like, everything's alive, blah, blah, blah. Where does that come from? It's this assumption of, like, the rest of nature is like me. But some people don't have that. It's a really it is a really primitive idea. At the same time, it's a really complex and advanced idea. To have this idea that the rest of the world is living in the same way that I'm living. There must be some kind of way to communicate. The trees have their own community. When we're not there, and we can't hear them, but they sure talk about us between themselves. That kind of thing. You don't get that just because of the way you happen to get your food. You get that for an arbitrary privileging of some certain conceptions, in which, what are you going to do to explain it? It doesn't make sense, really. How do you get animism? Well, you have a privileging of an absolute conception of individual subjects. You don't think in these terms, but it's what you presuppose. So if I'm a subject and the person beside me is a subject, we kind of act the same. Animals seem to act the same. They seem to have some sort of consciousness. They seem to, like, respond to us. Plants grow and all these things. Maybe they, we can't hear them, but maybe, they have feelings. Maybe they also have consciousness. It's just a different kind. It's a sort of a generalization of things, but that has nothing to do with, relations of activities, of production, of, it does have to do with our intercourse, of the social and political conduct, but not exactly production as such. And even then, one asks, well, how do these relations of politics and social intercourse even arise? How in the world did, you get somebody you start with some abstract human beings out of nature? Where do these connections come from? Where does this privileging of ideas come from? How do they self-mediate? I don't know. Marx sure doesn't explain it.
All right, continuing. The production of ideas, of conceptions of consciousness, is at first directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. Conceiving, thinking, the mental intercourse of men appear at this stage as the direct efflux of their material behavior. The same applies to mental production as expressed in the language of politics, laws, morality, religion, metaphysics, etc. of a people. Men are the producers of their conceptions, ideas, etc. Real active men, as they are conditioned by a definite development of their productive forces and of the intercourse corresponding to these up to its furthest forms. Consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence, and the existence of men is their actual life process. If in all ideology men and their circumstance appear upside down, as in a camera obscura, Latin for dark room, this phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects on the retina does from their physical life process.
Seems pretty vulgar materialist to me.
Yeah, I knew
Yeah, very.
someone
Yeah.
was gonna say that.
I mean, look. Here's the thing. Like, and here I think Hegel's one better than Marx, in which Hegel acknowledges that
Just here.
obviously labor has a hand in conception. The thing is that labor is already a duality, an immediate duality of an actuality as well as a conception. You don't do things like you don't make a hammer and then conceptualize the hammer. No, you had to conceptualize as you were making a hammer. Real like purpose of labor, as like Marx loves to idolize, is already highly conceptually mediated business. It didn't just happen like you wave your hand. And it's not like that. It's really something you had to work with already. You already had to conceptualize. And the same thing happens with society in general, the foundation of society arising from nature, in which we have these certain capacities of conceptualization. We have these very primitive, intuitive forms of concept, whatever word we use, whatever we wish to say about them. We have some very, very intuitive sense of subjectivity. We have an intuitive sense of substance. We have an intuitive sense of, unity or disunity. And we arbitrarily privilege various different kinds. Whether you have this monistic view of the world, monotheistic, or you have a pluralistic, animistic, or what is it that,
Pantheist?
Yeah, pantheist. What would you call multiple gods?
Polytheist.
Polytheist.
Yeah, polytheism. Yeah.
And whether you have some sort of inkling of moving towards a complete externality or a complete internality, really has strangely no basis in anything you actually do, so much as just like what you culturally come to eventually concretize as the general culture. Certain individuals become more and more have more influence. People listen to them, and whatever they say, it's like that's it. And one looks at the oldest cultures that we have on record, for example, like China or India. They're very different. Strange. They're very similar, and they're very different in a really strangely peculiar ways, in which they're sort of inverted, and at the same time they're highly similar, despite being like inversions. In which you have senses of in Chinese statehood, like the state function, in which like you have a sort of this outsidedness, in which the innerness doesn't really have any primacy, like for them until very recently. Even now, China still has this markedly so, in which the community, the external community, matters more than you, the individual, as such. Your subjectivity is not of prime importance. But in India, you have a sort of opposite. Subjectivity as such is of the prime importance, but it's not your subjectivity as such, which is strange. And then the world itself becomes, the external world has, a secondary subordinate existence, the real world of, beyond samsara and all these things. And it's kind of this weird thing. And the ways of viewing the world, those ways of viewing the world are radically different and yet have a strangely similar sort of existence, which at the same time is still concretely different. I don't know, it's interesting. It's very interesting how people come about, to generate their life world. And it's not just based on this whole stupidity of labor. Like, it just doesn't happen, they were hunter-gatherers and that's why they believe that. No, it is often the case that one is hunter-gatherers because one has a certain outlook already, So, it's not to deny that the way of life is determinative, but it is to say that the way of life is the way of life, particularly because of a, cultural scheme that, just doesn't exactly precede it per se, but also, just either likely arises just as a reification of something that was fluid before, but which, eventually, because of the way society works and influence works, certain people codify it. Or it could be something enforced, somebody's like just brought it to slavery, blah, blah, blah. All right.
All right. In direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. That is to say, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real, active men, and on the basis of their real life process, we demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. The phantoms formed in the human brain are also, necessarily, sublimates of their material life process, which is empirically verifiable and bound to material premises. Morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology, and their corresponding forms of consciousness, thus no longer retain the semblance of independence. They have no history, no development. But men, developing their material production and their material intercourse, alter, along with their real existence, their thinking and the products of their thinking. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. In the first method of approach, the starting point of consciousness is consciousness taken as the living individual. In the second method, which conforms to real life, it is the real living individuals themselves, and consciousness is considered solely as their consciousness.
So, this is like a famous passage where I think most people, if they know anything about the German ideologies, is probably this and the last passage, and the next one are the ones that they've read or heard of. And it's highly reductive, very reductively materialist, very vulgar. In direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from earth to heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. And and part of his critique, yes, fits in which anybody who says the only reason that things are the way they are is because we believe they are. Well, one is they're right; they're just not fully right. They're just not completely concrete in just what they say. Obviously, the way things are is the way things are, partly because we believe in it. The king is only king because we accept that he is king.
Yeah.
So to say. So if the people cease to believe the king is king, guess what? He ain't king no more.
He's not the king no more.
And his whole feudal system is gone. If the ideas change, obviously the way of life must change. So Marx can't be stupid. He can't be saying, well, it's not how it works. Well, obviously the change of ideas needs to be part of it, but at the same time, it's he just says it in this very reductive way, which seems pretty stupid. But he's reacting to a certain trend, which I don't know. I always think that's really, really a bad thing because ultimately you're setting yourself up for once things are settled and things aren't just one-sided in the way what you're responding to. You seem a bit nutty, or at least kind of out of your mind when you make these like overcorrections, so to say.
Yeah.
But he says, that is to say, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, or imagine, conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real, active men on the basis of the real life process. We demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. So, if we want to understand, real people, we gotta set out from like the real people, not what they think about themselves, but what they really do. And I think, one cannot disagree with that. If certain Hegelians are to be believed, Hegel does this himself.
Mm-hmm.
Hegel doesn't really care so much about what people think or say about themselves so much as what they actually do uh, in thinking about themselves. You know,
Yeah, the truth is outside.
yeah. So the real concepts. Perhaps the other German idealists, the young Hegelians, were misunderstood this, and it's very likely it seems they did. In which concepts for Hegel, they're not the things inside your head. They're not the things you think or believe about yourself. They are really what you are and you do. That's what makes them objective.
Yeah. Objective taken from the root of object.
Yeah, they're about the actual object.
Yeah.
Because look, if what Marx says about himself here, about his own methodology, this shit isn't true for capital. And I've read some people who say, "Oh no, but it's true." No, it's not. They really twist it. People like Andy Blunden will go ahead and says like, the reason, it's like, Hegel would begin from the abstract, but Marx, the real materialist version is that Marx begins from the concrete. While Hegel would begin with value, Marx begins with a commodity. And that's just a pedantic point because it doesn't fucking matter in the end. Because in the end, guess what? A value ends up positing commodities anyways, as capital. So, as much as you want to deny the reality of value and you say, oh no, it's real labor, that's the real thing, it's not what the actual reality is. In the end, we do end up having this relationship of capital ends up being real, value ends up being real, it ends up actually positing labor itself. Strange as that may seem, that is the reality. So, Marx doesn't follow this process of, we're going to go with the real material process. No, he ends up going straight for what Hegel exactly does. So, the materialist method is not really coherent in that sense. The phantoms formed in the human brain are also necessarily supplements to the material life process, which is empirically verifiable and bound to material premises. So, this is common. It's a common critique of ideology, which is, what are the ideas you have? Well, it's because of the society you live in. It's because of the things you do. Which obviously, it's true for the most part. Yeah. If we're speaking about ideology and not, some sort of scientific knowledge. Why is it that the priest says, this? Well, because it kind of benefits the priest. Does the priest really say that? The likelihood is probably, is that absolutely necessary? No, not really. Some people really come to believe weird things because a voice in their head tells them so. Morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness thus no longer retain the semblance of independence. Indeed. They don't. And I don't know anybody who ever thought they did, but, I don't know. Like, for example, in something like Kant or Hegel or the the actual German idealists, not the young Hegelians, kind of speak about metaphysics. They're talking about something there which is just like the general presuppositions of the mind. And I mean, like, metaphysics is like really general stuff. Like, just like what is an object in general. It's stuff that you don't even think about. It's stuff that you already work with. Like, it's already latent in you. The Kantian philosophy is not about what people like know about objects for themselves. It's what people already implicitly know about objects, but which did not know explicitly, consciously. Kant's philosophy just takes itself to be finding out, what the mind already does, etc. Marx says, they have no history, no development. Says that ideas don't have a history. The ideas don't develop themselves. I would call bullshit on that, partly because, well, you can't really split the ideas from the material production. You can't split the material production from the ideas. You don't have a moment in which there's one and then the other. You can't be doing one without the other. They come in one package. Developing, but they have no history in development, but men developing their material production, their material intercourse, alter along with their real existence, their thinking, the products of their thinking. And that involves the thinking of thinking. You're not going to change your material process if you haven't thought about the material process, therefore transform that process into a thought and thought about that thought. Then you say, look, I could do this. And you make a better hammer.
Yeah.
So, look, the hammer does this, and then you start eventually making some weird shit like math equations and whatnot, and then you start making some really amazing stuff. Like numerology. Life is not determined by consciousness, but conscious determined by life. In the first method of approach, the starting point is consciousness taken as a living individual. In the second method, which conforms to real life, it is the real living individuals themselves, and consciousness considered solely as their conscious. Once again, the reduction is just not true. If consciousness did not determine life, you just wouldn't learn. And if you didn't learn, you'd be dead. Because that's really the process of consciousness for Hegel, at least the German idealists in general. There's a learning that goes on, especially for Hegel. For Hegel, consciousness is nothing but this mode of learning from itself. What else can it learn from except from itself? If you learn from some real relation, it doesn't come just out of the blue. It's a relation that is possible for consciousness. And the really advanced relations are relations which, consciousness has to realize for itself and see in what it already has presupposed. You think about objects and you think, like, well, it goes up and down. And you do a little bit of Aristotle and you said, okay, heavy objects fall down, or massive objects fall. Certain objects fall down, certain objects rise. It's their natural place. And, you take that to a certain limit. You keep that for, what was it, 1,500 years, maybe? And then you start getting some other kind of like thoughts going on, and you get ideas of forces. And how did those come about? Because there were issues with, these conceptions before that. If there wasn't, people just wouldn't have gone outside their way and gone, maybe there's a thing like gravity. I mean, this doesn't just happen. It didn't happen because some guy was working and all of a sudden gravity. No, it's like this whole thinking process that went on.
Yeah, I just think he's making more of a primitive point, or I don't know about primitive, but like a more obvious point that, things can be alive without consciousness, but, consciousness is derived from life because life is, like, you can be alive and then you think or have consciousness. And then consciousness is considered only as, my consciousness, not, I don't really consider, people maybe unconsciously consider other people as conscious, but usually they don't. A lot of people now see people as a means to an end or how they can help them or whatever.
No, I think he was talking about just consciousness
I don't think
as,
so.
basic idealism. Idealism is
Yeah,
consciousness determines the world,
but
whereas materialism
oh,
is,
yeah.
life determines consciousness, which,
Yeah.
is just a reflection of the world. Because it's
Okay.
more clear in the sentence after that. In the first method of approach, the starting point is consciousness, ideas, taken as a living individual, the reality
Yeah.
of the individual, or of the
As the conscious
individuals.
living being.
Yeah,
But
it's the sort of Descartes. I mean, he's going a bit up against like the Descartes idea, Cartesian dualism.
yeah.
That consciousness can be disentangled from life. That there is a soul, basically, that determines, the actual living organism. I mean, it makes sense if you think that's what he's critiquing, which it is what he's critiquing. But at the same time, it is such an outdated view by the time that Marx is around. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe regular people still believed in it, but philosophers had just long moved past that idea.
All right. Next paragraph. This method of approach is not devoid of premises. It starts out from the real premises and does not abandon them for a moment. Its premises are men, not in any fantastic isolation and rigidity, but in their actual, empirically perceptible process of development under definite conditions. As soon as this active life process is described, history ceases to be a collection of dead facts, as it is with the empiricists, themselves still abstract, or an imagined activity of imagined subjects, as with the idealists. And I think it's worth noting there, when he uses the word fantastic, he means fake, like fantasy. In the 1800s, the word fantastic was definitely not the word we think of today.
In the 18th century, these words still made sense, like
Yeah,
terrific and
yeah,
fable,
fabulous, yeah,
fabulous.
yeah, fabulous.
Like nowadays, the words like literally have almost no connection to their origin.
Mm-hmm.
Like
They
genius,
were like,
genius is like so different.
yep. It's like someone used them sarcastically one day, and then people thought that was the real definition. But what do we think about what he said here?
Yeah, it's just I don't know, grandstanding. I mean, every time the fact that he
Yeah,
feels like he's like, oh, it's the real, it's the definite, it's the concrete,
yeah,
without actually getting to anything concrete, or definite, or real.
yeah. Now he's taking shots at empiricists, but he's also taking shots at idealists, and it's difficult to like mediate his position.
When he says his premises are men, not in any fantastic isolation and rigidity, which is, he's critiquing the political economists, or
Yeah,
like the bourgeois ideologists, but in their actual empirically perceptible process of development under definite conditions, talking about men within society. As soon as this active life process is described, history ceases to be a collection of dead facts, as it is with the empiricists, themselves still abstract, or an imagined activity of imagined subjects, as with the idealist.
so he's talking about real people, not an imagined person or an isolated subject that's still abstract.
Yeah, but I mean, he himself is
Mm.
like really going about this in an abstract way. He says we're
Yeah,
going for we're starting with the real things, which is kind of an empiricist thing. We're just gonna take the facts. But the empiricists are abstract apparently. Well, they are,
yeah.
but
He's
because
talking
there's
about
Hume.
men as they are, like in their activity or whatever, rather than just men in general, just how they are or whatever. How?
Well, men as they are within society. It's not just their activity,
Yeah.
because one could still do men with their activity abstracted from society.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what a lot of psychology nowadays is.
Yeah, not much to say there. Just as grandstanding again. Okay, where speculation ends in real life, there real positive science begins. The representation of the practical activity, of the practical process of development of men. Empty talk about consciousness ceases, and real knowledge has to take its place. When reality is depicted, philosophy, as an independent branch of knowledge, loses its medium of existence. At the best, its place can only be taken by a summing up of the most general results, abstractions which arise from the observation of the historical development of men. Viewed apart from real history, these abstractions have in themselves no value whatsoever. They can only serve to facilitate the arrangement of historical material, to indicate the sequence of its separate strata. But they by no means afford a recipe or schema, as does philosophy, for neatly trimming the epochs of history. On the contrary, our difficulties begin only when we set about the observation and the arrangement, the real depiction of our historical material, whether of a past epoch or of the present. The removal of these difficulties is governed by premises which it is quite impossible to state here, but which only the study of the actual life process and the activity of the individuals of each epoch will make evident. We shall select here some of these abstractions, which we use in contradistinction to the ideologists, and shall illustrate them by historical examples.
So, yeah, more grandstanding. Where speculation ends in real life, and it's particularly talking about the ideologists, particularly probably Hegel most of all. Their real positive science begins, the representation of the practical activity of the practical process of development of men. Empty talk about consciousness ceases, and the real knowledge has to take its place. When reality is depicted, philosophy as an independent branch of knowledge loses its medium of existence. At best, its place can only be taken by summing up the most general results, abstractions which arise from the observation of the historical development of men. Viewed apart from real history, these abstractions have in themselves no value whatsoever. They can only serve to facilitate the arrangement of historical material, to indicate the sequence of its separate strata. But they by no means afford a recipe or schema, as does philosophy, for neatly trimming the apples of history. I said this doesn't make sense to me. I don't know what is the they.
The
abstractions.
The abstractions, yeah.
Okay, this whole thing tackles the speculation. Obviously, the usual thoughts knowledge people had of Hegel, in which apparently just nobody alive at the time really understood what the hell Hegel was about. Nobody understood the logic. Until Marx, read it again, and then he got it. At least somewhat, to a good extent. And that is that the whole thing about speculation is, Hegel begins with logic. Well, why? Because guess what? Everything we do and that we know logically. We think about it. So if you don't know how thinking works, you're not exactly going to be the best thinker. If you don't know what structures can legitimately connect to other structures, you can say a lot of weird stuff. It's kind of like synesthesia. Just because it happens doesn't mean it makes sense. Although synesthesia is probably just pretty cool, though.
No, I have it. It's kind of weird. Like, numbers appear as colors to me, which is one reason why I cannot do math for the life of me. Because a 7 and an 8 both look pink for some reason, so I have a hard time. Yeah, it's a bizarre thing. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
All
No,
right.
I don't want to go off on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. All right, that's interesting though.
Yeah, we can talk about it off camera
Sure.
or off the mic.
So when he says, when reality is depicted philosophy as an independent branch of knowledge, it loses its medium of existence. That's bullshit. I mean, just look at Plato. Like, don't fucking tell me that Plato is just Greek existence, taken up into its thought, because Greece was not Platonic. It did not live up to the standards of the Republic itself. Now, Plato was probably like the best of Greek thought, of Greek life, taken to its most rationalized form, and that's really it. And even then, it wasn't just Greek life. It went way beyond. A lot of stuff in Plato still to this day is pertinent. You don't have to be a Greek to get the value of that. So, and it's not just the most general results, abstractions. The abstractions that go on in philosophy are strangely very concrete. They're not as concrete as they could be, but there's quite a few things in which, you just get to a block and you realize, it's some really deep shit. Although, I will give it to Marx that philosophy is based on observations. It's based on observations of reason, as well as not just the observations of the world. And the reason is then given a sort of like this unhitched primacy. Well, why? Because we think about things. So thought has to somehow, and thought can think about itself. So, it has this capacity for self-abstraction, which is pretty dang absolute, and you can start just talking about pure structures. I mean, just look at math. You can't tell me math is based on our everyday existence. Pure mathematics is weird. Not that that's not that it's completely disconnected, because there are some people that come out, blah 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 blah. It begins with counting your fingers, and you count there's one apple and two apples, and then you got the concept of number. Yeah. Well, like, go talk to an actual mathematicians; they'll probably laugh at you. Because math theory has gone very, very far from that basis. So the rest of that is just typical Marxist assumptions. And we're about halfway through this, so I think we'll just leave it at that. We'll cut it off here.
I'm feeling tired anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't find this as interesting as I thought. I had hoped it would be.
Maybe it'll get better. You come back to it.
I mean, I guess mostly it's because like a lot of this is just hey, Marx has. We've kind of heard Marx say this before. There's not really much else to say.
Not as much shit posting as we would like.
Yeah. I also kind of expected it to be a bit more polemic, but it kind of keeps it a bit serious. But alright, we'll leave it here, huh? Hope you people who listen, the very few, like probably 20 of you who listen, find it of any use. See you around.
Goodbye.